They wanted a no-contact order against me, but the truth about my son and me was more complicated than anyone knew. The no-contact order. The courtroom smelled like old wood and consequence. I sat in the third row, hands folded in my lap like a man who had already accepted the verdict before a single word was read aloud. 63 years old, retired firefighter, 22 years sober, and somehow I was the villain in this story. Somehow, I was the one who needed to be stopped. My son, Marcus, sat at the petitioner's table with his wife, Danny, and her attorney. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me in 4 months, not since the day she filed the order. His jaw was set in that way I recognized from when he was 16 and convinced he knew everything, that particular brand of young man's certainty that costs older men everything they love. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose, opened the folder in front of her. I watched her scan the first page, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did a slight tightening, a recalibration. "This is a petition for a permanent no-contact order," she said, "filed by Danielle Mercer against her father-in-law, Raymond Mercer, on the grounds of psychological harm, toxic influence, and interference with the marital unit." She paused. "Mr. Mercer, you've filed a response, and I understand you've brought documentation." My attorney, a young man named Pete who charged too much but believed me, nodded from beside me. "Yes, Your Honor." What Danny had written in her petition was thorough, I'll give her that. She was smart. Marcus had always had good taste in smart women, even when they used that intelligence against him. The petition said I called too often, that I undermined her authority in her own home, that I told Marcus, on the night of their 3rd anniversary, that I thought he deserved more. She wasn't wrong about that last part. What she didn't include was the context. What she left out was the 18 months prior, the way she had slowly, methodically, rearranged the furniture of my son's life until there was no comfortable place left for anyone who had known him before her. She hadn't mentioned the Christmas I drove 4 hours and was told at the door that Marcus was unavailable. She hadn't mentioned the grandchildren I had been permitted to see exactly twice in 2 years. She hadn't mentioned the phone calls where Marcus would go quiet mid-sentence. That specific silence I learned to recognize as the sound of someone else entering the room. I had documentation of all of it, text messages, a journal I'd kept not out of litigiousness, but because my therapist had told me to write things down to keep myself honest, to make sure I wasn't the problem. Dates, times, voicemails Marcus had left me when Danny was traveling, his voice looser, warmer, more like the boy I raised. Those voicemails were the hardest evidence to submit because they made me sound like I was winning, and I wasn't trying to win anything. I was trying not to lose my son. The judge read for a long time. The courtroom was very quiet. I could hear Danny whispering something to her attorney. I kept my eyes forward. Finally, the judge removed her glasses and set them on the folder. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice had shifted into something more careful, "I've reviewed both the petition and your response in full." She looked at me directly. "I want to say something before I issue my ruling, and I want both parties to hear it clearly." Marcus finally looked up. "In 21 years on this bench," she said, "I have granted a great many protective orders. I have also denied a great many. The standard I apply is not whether a relationship is difficult or whether an in-law is overbearing or whether family members disagree about boundaries. The standard is harm, documented, substantiated harm." She tapped the folder. "What I find in this petition is a family in pain. What I do not find is evidence sufficient to restrict a parent's contact with his adult child by force of law." Danny's attorney leaned in quickly, but the judge raised one hand. "The petition is denied." 3 words. I had been waiting 4 months to hear 3 words, and when they came, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something closer to grief, the particular grief of being right about something you wish you'd been wrong about. Because if the order had been granted, at least there would have been a reason. At least the fracture in my family would have had a legal explanation, something solid to point at. Instead, the denial just meant that everything broken between us was simply broken. There was no order to blame. There was only us, me, and Marcus, and whatever had happened to the man I thought I'd raised. However, the judge continued, and I held still, I am recommending that both parties engage in family mediation. Mr. Raymond Mercer, this recommendation applies to you equally. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Being legally in the right does not mean a relationship is healthy. The court sees no basis for a no-contact order. The court does see a family that needs help. I nodded. I meant it. Outside on the courthouse steps, Pete clapped me on the shoulder and said something about next steps. I wasn't listening. I was watching the door because I knew Marcus would come through it eventually, and I had decided, somewhere during the judge's ruling, that I wasn't going to walk to my car without at least trying. He came through the door alone. Danny must have taken a different exit. For a moment, we just stood there, my son and I, in the cold March air, with the traffic moving behind us like the world had somewhere to be. "Dad," he said, his voice was tired. "I know," I said. "I didn't want," he stopped, started again. "I didn't want it to get here." "I know that too." He looked older than 34. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "The judge mentioned mediation," I said carefully. He was quiet for a moment, then slowly he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a nod on courthouse steps in the cold, and it was the most my son had given me in 2 years, and I held on to it the entire drive home, 4 hours, same as Christmas, except this time nobody told me to turn around. This time I was already headed somewhere worth going.